We often think of poverty as simply not having enough food, right?
Mm.
That the biggest worry for someone struggling is just, getting enough calories.
Yeah, that's a common picture.
But what if that picture is way too simple? What if that basic idea, well, it hides a much more surprising and complex reality?
That's exactly the question we're tackling today.
Mm.
We're diving deep into this groundbreaking book, Poor Economics, a radical rethinking of the way to fight global poverty.
Mhm.
And this isn't just theory. It's built on years of really detailed research, observations in developing countries.
Right.
The authors really got into the day-to-day lives of people with very little, trying to understand their economic choices, their constraints.
So our goal today is to really challenge some of those maybe gut feelings we might have about poverty.
Yeah.
We want to look beyond just the idea that it's all about hunger and get a much more nuanced view of what it means to live with scarcity.
Exactly. Understand the why behind the choices.
Yeah, hoping for some real aha moments. Moments that can help us understand not only maybe how to better address poverty, but also just how we all make decisions when resources are tight. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. So let's start with that fundamental idea. Poverty as hunger.
Okay.
For a long, long time, even in major initiatives like the Millennium Development Goals, the definition of poverty was tied to having enough income to buy a certain number of calories plus, other basic necessities.
So the core assumption was if you're poor, you're fundamentally not eating enough.
That was it. Simple as that, seemingly.
And this has shaped a lot of how we've tried to help, hasn't it? I mean, food subsidy programs are everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. The book mentions Egypt spending huge amounts, Indonesia with its rice subsidies.
And India's massive food distribution system.
Right. It seems like the go-to solution has always been get more food to people.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The book throws a real curveball at this idea.
It really does. What the researchers found, looking at price data from the Philippines, I believe, was that even for people living on extremely low incomes, like less than $1 a day, kind of levels the actual cost of getting enough calories.
Yeah.
Around 2,400 with enough protein and fat was surprisingly low.
How low?
They figured it could be done for about 21 cents a day in purchasing power parity terms.
21 cents.
Yeah. Now, the catch is this ultra-cheap diet would be almost exclusively bananas and eggs.
Bananas and eggs all day, every day. Okay, so theoretically, the money for basic calories is often maybe within reach?
Potentially, yes. But the crucial insight here, the real kicker, is that people living in poverty often choose to spend their very limited money on other things.
That really makes you rethink things, doesn't it?
It does.
It reminds me of Orwell's observations back in The Road to Wigan Pier, where even in really tough times, poor families found ways to buy things beyond just basic food.
Exactly. And the book highlights how in places like India and Mexico, with their large domestic markets, there are tons of affordable consumer goods available even in very remote areas.
Like what kind of things?
Oh, single-use shampoo packets,
Yeah.
individual cigarettes, cheap toys, sweets, that sort of stuff.
Okay, so while basic calories might be cheap, people living in poverty, just like everyone else, have a whole range of needs and wants.
Precisely. Which leads to a crucial question. If it's not simply a lack of food driving poverty, what other economics factors and limitations are really at play?
And this brings us to the idea of poverty traps, right?
Exactly. Poverty trap.
Okay, so what exactly is a poverty trap? The book lays it out pretty clearly.
Yeah, essentially a poverty trap exists when it's incredibly difficult, maybe almost impossible, for people with very little to invest to significantly increase their income or wealth.
Like they're stuck.
They're stuck. But crucially, those who can invest even a small amount might see much faster growth. Think of it like being stuck on a very low rung of a ladder. It's almost impossible to climb higher, even if you work incredibly hard.
Okay.
Now, if the potential for rapid growth is actually high for the poor, and then it just gradually slows down as they get wealthier, well then a poverty trap probably isn't in play.
So it depends on the shape of that growth potential.
Right. The book even uses diagrams, showing like an S-shaped curve for a poverty trap versus a curve that starts steep and flattens out. Illustrates the difference.
And to make this less abstract, they give the example of Pak Solan in Indonesia. Can you tell us a bit about his situation?
Oh, Pak Solan's story really makes this concept concrete. His parents had a small plot of land, right? But they had 13 children.
13.
Yeah. So the land had to be divided so many times just for housing that there was basically no land left for farming.
Wow, okay.
So Pak Solon ended up as a casual farm laborer, earning very little each day. But then things got worse. When fertilizer and fuel prices went up, farmers cut costs. But instead of lowering wages, they just stopped hiring workers for many tasks.
So he lost his job.
Lost his job for most of a year. And the thing is, he was too old to realistically start learning a skilled trade and maybe not strong enough anymore for really demanding construction work.
So he was essentially trapped.
Exactly. Trapped with very few options to improve his situation. It's a really clear example of how a lack of initial resources can severely limit your future opportunities for growth.
That paints a really vivid picture of being stuck. But the book also points out that this isn't always the case, right? Sometimes there is a lot of potential for the poor to grow their income.
Right, and it just naturally levels off as they become more prosperous. So it really depends on the shape of that income growth curve. As you said, it's not a universal thing.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about something we often associate with poverty: health and productivity.
Yeah, this is another area where some common beliefs get, well, challenged quite a bit.
How so?
The book discusses this interesting case of anemic Indonesian workers who didn't buy iron-fortified fish sauce, even when it was readily available and promoted.
Why not? You'd think they'd want the health benefits.
Well, one possible reason is that the connection between better nutrition and higher earnings isn't always direct or obvious, especially if you're paid a fixed wage.
Okay, so your employer might not notice or reward you if you're suddenly a bit more productive because you're not anemic anymore.
Exactly. But interestingly, a study in the Philippines found something different. Workers paid piece rate, meaning they earned more for producing more, did eat significantly more on those days compared to when they worked for a flat daily wage.
That makes a lot of sense. If your pay isn't directly linked to how much you work or produce, there's less immediate financial motivation to invest in things like better nutrition that might boost your productivity.
Precisely. It's about incentives.
The book also looks at the really significant long-term impact of malaria on poverty.
Yes, the evidence on malaria is quite striking. Studies comparing areas with high and low malaria rates before and after eradication efforts consistently show major effects.
Like what?
Children born in areas where malaria was common basically catch up in education and, importantly, earnings with those from low malaria areas once the disease is controlled.
Catch up how much?
Well, one study looking at the U.S. South and Latin America suggested that growing up malaria-free could lead to a 50% higher annual income throughout adulthood.
50%? That's enormous.
It's huge. And similar results, although maybe varying a bit in size, have been found in India, Paraguay, Sri Lanka. It really highlights the huge long-term financial benefits of investing in malaria prevention. It's not just a health issue.
Wow. That really shows how health isn't just a personal issue. It has these profound economic consequences for individuals and, well, whole societies.
Absolutely.
Now, let's move to something that surprised me quite a bit when reading about it: the shortcomings in how public health and education are delivered. You'd think free services would be eagerly used by those with the fewest resources.
That's what you'd logically expect, right? But the book presents some really striking findings from Udaipur, India.
What did they find?
They found that the poor largely avoided the free public health services, even though the facilities, like local health centers with nurses, were physically accessible.
Avoided them. So where did they go?
They often preferred more expensive private doctors, and sometimes even traditional healers.
That seems counterintuitive. Why would someone with very little money choose a more expensive option? Isn't that irrational?
Well, the reasons are quite complex, it seems. One major factor appears to be the perceived quality of care.
Quality.
Yeah. Research described in the book, which they called the 333 rule, found that the average doctor-patient interaction in India, in both public and private settings, mind you, lasted only about 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Yeah. The doctor would ask maybe 3 questions, perhaps do a quick examination, and then usually prescribe, you guessed it, 3 medications.
Wow. That's fast.
Very fast. And what's concerning is that the situation was often reported as worse in the public sector. Even shorter consultations, maybe less physical examination.
So it's not just about whether services are available. It's about the quality, or at least the perceived quality, and how effective people believe that care will actually be.
Exactly. And the book also touches on some interesting beliefs and cultural factors that influence these choices too.
Like what?
Well, for example, there's apparently a strong belief among some people that injections are just inherently more effective than pills.
Really?
Yeah. And to question that requires a certain level of, understanding of how the body works, which not everyone might have.
Okay, that makes sense.
Also, think about it. It's difficult for anyone, not just the poor, to really know if a treatment is working,
Mhm.
especially since many common illnesses just get better on their own over time.
True.
So if someone gets a shot and then feels better a few days later, they're very likely to credit the shot, even if they would have recovered anyway.
So that reinforces the belief in the power of injections.
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
And this can create a preference for treatments that seem more powerful or immediate, like injections, and maybe a distrust of public healthcare providers who might offer less visible treatments or simply spend less time with patients.
This reminds me of that Seva Mandir immunization program in Udaipur you mentioned earlier. That's a really clear example of how understanding these behavioral quirks, these preferences, can lead to surprisingly successful solutions.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. Seva Mandir, this NGO, tried offering a small incentive, just a couple of pounds of lentils and some stainless steel plates for each set of immunizations completed.
Lentils and plates. Okay.
Seems small, right?
Yeah.
But the results were remarkable. Immunization rates in the villages where the incentives were offered jumped sevenfold.
7 times higher. Just for some Dallin plates.
Yep. Apparently, initially, there was some hesitation internally about, bribing people to do what's good for them. And the power of such a seemingly small incentive was really underestimated.
It's amazing how a seemingly small nudge can have such a big impact. What does this tell us about how people living in poverty make decisions, or maybe how all of us make decisions?
It really highlights the importance of behavioral economics and development. Ideas like time inconsistency.
What's that again?
It's basically our tendency to value immediate rewards much more than future benefits, even if the future benefits are bigger. We procrastinate.
Ah, right, putting things off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So time inconsistency and maybe underestimating the future benefits of something like immunization probably play a big role in why rates are often low. People might fully intend to get their children vaccinated, but they just keep putting it off.
So the small, immediate reward, the lentils and plates, helps overcome that procrastination barrier.
Precisely. Small nudges like these incentives can help overcome these mental hurdles, these behavioral biases.
Okay.
And the book draws this really neat comparison to our own lives, what they call the view from our couch.
The view from our couch.
Yeah, meaning that those of us who aren't living in extreme poverty benefit from lots of systems and defaults that make it easier to do the right thing without constant effort and complex decision-making.
Like what?
Like having clean water piped directly into our homes, automatic school immunization requirements, health insurance discounts for going to the gym, automatic retirement savings deductions.
Okay. Things that happen almost automatically, or where the default is the beneficial option.
Exactly. People living in poverty often don't have these built-in advantages. They have to make active choices about these things constantly, often under conditions of stress and scarcity.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we're on autopilot for many good behaviors, while people in poverty have to actively navigate and make those choices under much tougher circumstances.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, let's focus on education. Another critical area, obviously, for escaping poverty.
And the challenges in education in many developing countries are, well, they're significant. The book cites this thing called the World Absenteeism Survey.
Okay.
It found that, on average, teachers in public schools across several countries, Bangladesh, Ecuador, India, Indonesia, Peru, Uganda, are absent about 1 day out of every 5.
1 day in 5, that's 20%.
Yeah, and the rates were even higher in India and Uganda. And it's not just about being physically absent. The study also noted that even when teachers are there, they might not actually be actively teaching.
That's shocking. How can children possibly learn consistently if their teachers aren't even showing up or not teaching when they do?
It's a massive problem. And the book contrasts this with what they found in private schools in India.
What was the difference?
Interestingly, they found that private schools in India often have better teacher attendance, and their students tend to perform better on tests, even when comparing children within the same family who attend different types of schools.
So it's not just that wealthier families send kids to private school.
It suggests not entirely, no. While families who choose private schools might be different in some ways, maybe more motivated, the difference in performance between private and public school students was found to be much larger than the difference between children from the wealthiest and poorest backgrounds attending the same type of school.
Huh. But the book also says private schools aren't necessarily a silver bullet, right?
Right. They aren't always as effective as they could be either. which leads to this really interesting example of Pratham's Balsaki program.
Balsaki. Tell me about that. It sounded like a surprisingly effective solution.
It really was. Pratham is this large Indian nonprofit focused on education. They created the Balsaki program, which basically paired students who are falling behind with young women from their own community, the Balsakis.
Okay. Were these women trained teachers?
No, that's the key thing. They generally had less formal education than typical teachers, maybe just high school themselves, but they received very focused training on how to teach basic literacy and numeracy skills.
And how did they do?
Despite their limited formal schooling, these Balsakis achieved remarkable improvements in the test scores of the children they tutored. In some cases, the gains were comparable to, or even surpassed, the average gains seen in private schools.
That's incredible. Using less educated tutors achieved results as good as or better than private schools.
In terms of improving basic skills for struggling kids, yes. It really makes you question the traditional ways we think about who can teach effectively and what kind of training is most important, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The book also discusses how parents' own expectations about education can sometimes unintentionally hinder their children's progress.
Yeah, this is fascinating. The book suggests that some parents might see the benefits of education as following an S-shaped curve.
S-shaped, meaning?
Meaning they believe that the real payoff, the significant returns from education, only come much later, like if their child manages to pass major graduation exams and get a government job or something similar. They see little value in the early years or basic skills alone.
So if they don't see immediate results or don't think their child will make it all the way to the end goal?
They might underinvest in the child's early education. They might pull them out of school for work or just not push them as hard on the basics.
Which could inadvertently create a kind of poverty trap, where the child never gets the foundational skills needed for later success.
Exactly. It's a potential trap rooted in expectations. And the education systems themselves in many developing countries are described as quite elitist.
Elitist. How so?
Often stemming from colonial times. They were designed primarily to identify and train a small administrative elite, focused on preparing a select few for very tough exams, rather than ensuring everyone learns basic reading and math well.
It's like the whole system is designed to filter people out rather than to lift everyone up.
That's a good way to put it. And this pressure to have a modern, comprehensive curriculum often leads to, kids carrying incredibly heavy book bags full of subjects they can't actually read or understand.
The book had that anecdote, didn't it?
Yeah.
About the child in Uttarakhand who just refused to even try reading.
Yes. That moment perfectly captures how low expectations and just a feeling of hopelessness or futility can take root. Why bother trying if I'm never going to get it anyway?
So sad.
And there's that other report, the Puro EB report, finding that some teachers actively tried to avoid being posted in what they call backward villages because they just didn't think the students there had any potential.
Wow. That's, ingrained pessimism from the teachers themselves.
It really is. However, the book does offer a hopeful perspective here.
Okay, good. What's the good news?
The good news, they argue, is that making sure every child masters the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, is not only possible, but actually quite achievable if that becomes the explicit primary focus of the education system.
Instead of trying to cram in a dozen subjects poorly.
Exactly.
Right.
Focus relentlessly on the fundamentals. And they cite this Israeli social experiment with Ethiopian Jewish immigrant children as powerful evidence.
What happened there?
These children arrived in Israel, often from families with very little or no formal education, facing significant cultural and economic disadvantages early in life. They entered Israeli schools alongside much more advantaged native Israeli students.
Yeah.
Years later, researchers found that the gap in their educational achievement levels had significantly narrowed. It showed that even substantial early disadvantages can be largely overcome if the school environment provides the right conditions and focus.
That is encouraging. It suggests it's not predetermined by background.
Not at all. So the book argues for maybe scaling down expectations in terms of curriculum breadth, focusing intensely on core skills, using technology smartly to supplement or even substitute for teachers where needed.
Even if that means maybe a less rich curriculum for some.
Well, the authors address the concern about creating a two-tiered system by pointing out that the current reality often leaves many children, especially the poorest, with virtually no meaningful education at all. So focusing on ensuring foundational learning for everyone might be far more equitable.
Right. Getting the basics right for everyone is better than aiming for an advanced curriculum that most kids can't access.
Okay, Let's tackle another complex topic.
Mm.
Family size and poverty. There are so many different viewpoints on this, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. There's this long-standing debate, going back centuries, really, to Malthus and beyond.
About whether large families inevitably lead to poverty because resources get spread too thin.
Exactly. And more recently, economists like Gary Becker developed the quality-quantity trade-off theory.
Which suggests that as families have more children, quantity, they tend to invest less in each child's education and health quality. Seems logical on the surface.
Does the data back that up?
Well, the book's own data from 18 countries does show a correlation in many places. Larger families often correlate with less education per child. But
There's a but.
there's a but. It's not always clear which one is causing the other.
Mm-hmm.
Do large families cause less investment? Or do factors that lead to less investment also lead to larger families? Causality is tricky.
Okay. But the book also presents some surprising research that directly challenges the straightforward link between family size and less investment in children, right?
Exactly. This is where it gets really interesting. Researchers have used clever methods to look at situations where family size increased somewhat unexpectedly,
Like how?
like studying families who had twins, which suddenly increases family size beyond what they might have planned, or looking at how the sex of previous children influences the decision to have more kids in some cultures.
And what did they find in those cases? Does having an extra kid, like a twin, mean the other kids get less education?
Surprisingly, they found very little consistent evidence that children in slightly larger families, due to these shocks, ended up with significantly less education or worse health outcomes compared to those in slightly smaller families.
Really? Even in poor settings?
Even in poor settings. One study in Israel looked specifically at very poor Israeli Arab families, where family sizes are traditionally large, and found no negative impact of larger family size on children's educational attainment.
Huh. That goes against the simple trade-off idea.
It does. And there was Nancy Kane's provocative research suggesting that in some contexts, having more sisters versus brothers might actually increase a daughter's educational attainment, maybe due to household chore allocation or something.
Wow. Okay, so the relationship between family size and poverty or investment in kids is clearly way more complex than the simple more kids, less for each theory suggests.
Much more complex. Context matters a lot. Beliefs matter. It's not a straightforward calculation.
All right, let's move on to microfinance. This was hailed for a long time as a major solution, a key way to help people escape poverty.
It definitely was. Microfinance really emerged as a way to tackle two big problems. First, the fact that most poor people lack access to formal loans from banks.
Right, they can't just walk into a bank and get a business loan.
Exactly. And second, the incredibly high, often exploitative interest rates charged by informal moneylenders in many communities.
Loan sharks, basically.
Pretty much. So the
Yeah.
basic idea behind microfinance is simple and appealing. Provide small loans, microloans at sustainable but not exploitative interest rates.
To help people start or expand their small businesses.
Precisely. The classic example is the fruit seller who has to borrow from the wholesaler every single day at a huge implicit interest rate. A small loan could allow her to buy inventory in bulk, save money, and increase profits.
And the data showed that poor people really didn't borrow much from banks, right?
Very little. The book cites data from rural Udaipur, urban Hyderabad in India, and across their 18-country data set, showing very low rates of borrowing from formal institutions among the poor. But they did borrow from informal sources, often at incredibly high rates.
So microfinance institutions, MFIs, stepped in. How did they manage to lend successfully where banks failed?
They used different methods, often group lending, where members of a small group guarantee each other's loans. This creates social pressure to repay. They also had frequent repayment schedules and loan officers who were very involved in the local community.
And it worked, didn't it, in terms of getting repaid?
Remarkably well, actually. Many MFIs reported very low default rates, much lower than traditional banks might expect lending to that population.
So for a while, microfinance was really seen as this visible, almost heroic tool in the fight against poverty.
It absolutely was. It got a huge amount of positive attention, Nobel Prizes. It felt like a real breakthrough.
There's another but coming, isn't there?
There is. The book points out that despite the success in lending and repayment, there's actually a surprising lack of rigorous, large-scale evidence showing that microfinance has had a major transformative impact on reducing poverty overall.
So people got loans, they mostly repaid them, but it didn't necessarily lift huge numbers of people out of poverty.
The evidence for widespread poverty reduction is weaker than the initial enthusiasm suggested. Maybe the loans were used more for consumption smoothing, handling emergencies, paying bills, than for significant business investment and growth. Or maybe the businesses started just weren't that profitable.
And there were also some controversies, right? Like in Andhra Pradesh.
Yes, that was a major crisis. There were reports linking aggressive loan recovery practices by some MFIs, like SKS, to a tragic wave of farmer suicides. It raised serious concerns about whether the pressure to maintain low default rates had led to coercive tactics.
That definitely tarnished the image.
It did. And it sparked a big debate within the MFI community itself about the risks of becoming too focused on financial returns versus the social mission, and whether rules on defaults needed to be relaxed or enforced differently.
So the conclusion seems to be that while microfinance has clearly been successful in reaching and lending to a lot of people living in poverty who were previously excluded,
Yes, that's a major achievement.
its effectiveness as a widespread poverty reduction strategy, and especially as a reliable stepping stone for significant growth-oriented entrepreneurship, seems, well, more complicated and maybe less impactful than initially hoped.
That sums it up pretty well. It's a useful tool, but perhaps not the magic bullet it was once thought to be.
Okay. This brings us nicely to the idea of the entrepreneurial poor.
Right. This is another area where our stereotypes often fall short. We might imagine people in poverty just waiting for handouts or lacking initiative.
Yeah, that's a common, if unfair, stereotype.
But the book presents data showing surprisingly high rates of self-employment among both the urban and rural poor in developing countries, often much higher percentages than you see in developed OECD countries.
So lots of people are running their own tiny businesses.
Lots of them. Little shops, street vending, small repair services, casual labor.
Yeah.
A huge amount of activity.
But the book raises a crucial question about this, doesn't it?
It does. It asks, are these small businesses genuinely entrepreneurial in the sense we usually mean businesses with real potential for innovation, growth, and job creation? Or are they primarily businesses born out of necessity? Meaning, are people doing this because it's the only way to scrape together some income when formal jobs are scarce or inaccessible? Is it more about survival than ambition for growth?
That's a critical distinction. Is it entrepreneurship driven by opportunity or entrepreneurship driven by a lack of other options?
Exactly. And the evidence often points more towards the latter for the vast majority of these microenterprises. They provide a living, perhaps, but don't often grow into larger, more productive firms.
Okay. This leads us then to the importance of, well, real opportunity and the surrounding context in breaking cycles of poverty. It's not just about individual effort or small loans.
Absolutely. The book uses the example of that village near the zinc factory in Udaipur.
What happened there?
Before the factory, it was a standard, poor agricultural village. But the arrival of the factory, offering stable, relatively well-paid jobs, completely changed things over generations.
How so?
It created a virtuous cycle. People saw that education could lead to a good factory job, so they invested more in their children's schooling. Human capital increased. Wages went up. The whole community benefited.
So one single large-scale opportunity had a ripple effect.
A huge ripple effect. And other studies confirm this. Foster and Rosenzweig's research showed the significant positive impact of factory jobs arriving in rural Indian villages on wage growth and poverty reduction.
And there was that study on Mexican children too, right?
Yes. The one looking at kids whose mothers got jobs in the maquiladoras, the factories near the border.
What did that show?
It demonstrated this incredibly powerful effect of stable employment on children's well-being. The children of mothers who worked in the factories ended up being significantly taller on average.
Taller. Just because their moms had a factory job.
Yeah, likely due to better nutrition and healthcare access afforded by the stable income. It's a stark indicator of improved overall well-being flowing from that job opportunity.
Wow. It really underscores that having a stable job, a reliable source of income, can fundamentally change people's outlook on life and their ability to invest in the future, their kids' future.
It absolutely can.
Yeah.
It provides a sense of security and possibility that might be missing otherwise.
Okay. Finally, let's touch on the role of information, beliefs, and, well, biases in the lives of people living in poverty. This seems to tie a lot of the threads together.
It really does. A core argument in the book is that people living in poverty often have to make incredibly important decisions with limited information and sometimes with fundamentally incorrect beliefs about crucial aspects of their lives.
Like what kind of beliefs?
Beliefs about health, how diseases are transmitted, how effective treatments are, beliefs about education, the real returns to schooling, beliefs about agriculture, the right amount of fertilizer to use, even beliefs about politics, how corrupt politicians are or aren't.
And these inaccurate beliefs can lead to choices that are, well, not in their best interest, right? Like not using bed nets or not adopting profitable farming techniques.
Exactly. If you don't believe mosquitoes cause malaria, or you think the fertilizer will ruin your soil based on misinformation, you won't take the beneficial action. And uncertainty, combined with that procrastination tendency we talked about.
Time inconsistency.
Right. They can interact to really hinder beneficial actions, like getting vaccinations or saving money. If you're not sure it will work, and it requires effort now for a benefit later, it's easy to put it off indefinitely.
And this lack of information can even influence things like voting.
The book suggests it can. If voters lack reliable information about candidates' performance or policies, they might fall back on voting along ethnic or caste lines, which can unfortunately make it easier for corrupt or ineffective politicians to stay in power.
But the encouraging thing here, again, seems to be that sometimes providing simple, clear information can make a big difference.
Absolutely. There are examples where relatively simple information interventions telling people the actual benefits of fertilizer, providing report cards on politicians' performance, have had significant positive impacts on behavior and outcomes. Information matters.
It all seems to come back to making it easier for people to make informed choices and take actions that will benefit them in the long run, which connects to that idea of external systems and defaults you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. The book argues that as people's income levels rise, more and more right decisions tend to happen automatically or are strongly encouraged by the external systems around them.
Like the piped water, fortified foods.
Fortified foods being widely available, automatic enrollment in retirement plans, easily accessible banking. These things reduce the cognitive load and the need for constant, active, self-controlled decision-making for every little thing.
Whereas people living in poverty often lack these built-in advantages, these helpful defaults.
Exactly. They have to exert more willpower, gather more information, and make more active choices just to achieve basic positive outcomes that others might take for granted. So, making it easier for them to do the right thing through better default options, small nudges, easily accessible services.
Like widespread iron-fortified salt or simple, easy-to-access savings accounts?
Exactly. Those kinds of things can significantly improve their lives by reducing the burden of constant high-stakes decision-making under scarcity.
So, wrapping this all together, the key message seems to be the absolute need for a really nuanced understanding. We have to get past the simple stereotypes.
Definitely.
We need to truly grasp the specific challenges, the constraints, the logic behind the decisions people make when living in poverty.
Yes, understanding that logic is crucial. It's not about judging choices, but understanding the context in which they're made.
And then, critically, we need to rigorously test potential solutions to see what actually works, where, and why.
Exactly. Moving beyond ideology and simple assumptions, actively listening to the experiences of people living in poverty, and using careful testing like the randomized controlled trials pioneered by JPL, the research center founded by the authors and others, are essential.
It's the only way to identify policies that are genuinely effective in helping people escape poverty traps and build better lives.
That's the goal. Understand the traps to help dismantle them.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are maybe a couple of the most surprising or counterintuitive insights that really stand out for you from poor economics?
Okay. I think one of the most striking, going back to the start, is that poverty isn't simply about a lack of food or calories.
Right.
People living in poverty often could afford basic nutrition, but they make complex choices about how to use their limited resources, balancing needs and desires just like anyone else.
That's a big one. What else?
Another key takeaway for me is the significant power of seemingly small behavioral nudges and well-designed systems.
The lentils and plates effect.
Yeah. Helping people overcome procrastination, making the beneficial choice the easy or default choice, can have disproportionately large impacts on long-term well-being. It acknowledges our shared human psychology.
Okay, good point. And maybe one more.
And finally, I think the book really challenges that common image of the poor as somehow lacking initiative. It highlights their incredibly high rates of self-employment.
The entrepreneurial poor.
Right. But frames it realistically, often driven more by necessity and a lack of other options than by high-growth ambition. It's resourcefulness born from constraint.
Those are definitely some powerful points that really make you rethink things. Okay, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. If people living in poverty face fundamentally similar behavioral biases as the rest of us, things like putting things off, having imperfect information, being swayed by how choices are presented. Does that fundamentally change how we should approach aid and development? Does it shift some responsibility towards designing better systems and context rather than focusing solely on individual choices or failings?
Hmm.
It's definitely something to consider. If you found this deep dive into poor economics insightful, we highly recommend checking out the book itself. And maybe look into the ongoing work of organizations like JPAL for more on this fascinating and absolutely crucial field.